On the morning of May 28, 1944, German reconnaissance pilot Oberleutnant Werner Baumbach guided his Messerschmitt Bf 109 through the early morning haze over the English countryside. His mission was routine but critical. Photograph the military build-up along England's southeastern coast that German intelligence believed was preparing for the inevitable Allied invasion of France. As he swept low over Kent and Essex, his cameras clicking methodically, Baumbach could barely contain his excitement at what he was seeing below. Spread across the fields and marshalling yards were hundreds of tanks, American Shermans and British Churchills, their hulls clearly visible even from altitude. Landing craft crowded the harbors and estuaries, so many that they seemed to touch gunwale to gunwale. Ammunition dumps stretched for acres, carefully camouflaged but still detectable to his experienced eye. Supply depots, field hospitals, vehicle parks, all the infrastructure of an army preparing for the largest amphibious assault in history. Baumbach landed at his base in occupied France and rushed his film to intelligence analysts. Within hours, the photographs were on a train to Berlin, marked for immediate attention by the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command. When those photographs reached the desk of General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations, they confirmed what German intelligence had been reporting for months. The Allies were massing the 1st United States Army Group in southeastern England, directly across from the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. There was only one problem with Baumbach's reconnaissance, with the intelligence reports, with the photographs that seemed to show irrefutable proof of Allied intentions. None of it was real. The tanks were inflatable rubber dummies. The landing craft were plywood and canvas frames floating on oil drums. The supply depots were filled with crates of sawdust. The entire army, its vehicles, its infrastructure, its apparent preparations for invasion, was an elaborate fiction created by a small team of British artists, set designers, engineers, and intelligence officers whose mission was to convince Adolf Hitler that the Allied invasion of Europe would strike at Calais, not Normandy. It would become known as Operation Fortitude, and it was the greatest deception operation in military history. The story began not in England, but in the bitter aftermath of the Dieppe raid of August 1942. That disastrous operation in which Canadian and British commandos attempted to seize the French port city of Dieppe ended in catastrophe. Of the 6,000 men who landed on the beaches, nearly 4,000 were killed or captured within hours. The Germans, having been alerted to the attack through intercepted communications and their own reconnaissance, had reinforced Dieppe's defenses to overwhelming strength. The raid accomplished nothing except to demonstrate a harsh truth. The Germans were too good at intelligence gathering, too quick to reinforce threatened positions, too efficient at defensive warfare to be defeated by conventional planning. Lieutenant Colonel John Bevan, a banker in civilian life who now headed the London Controlling Section, the innocuously named office responsible for Allied deception operations, drew a different conclusion from Dieppe than most military planners. While others saw the need for better planning, better intelligence, better coordination, Bevan saw something else: the need to deceive. If the Germans could be made to believe the invasion would come at one location, they would reinforce it heavily, leaving the actual invasion site comparatively weakened. The challenge was not merely to hide Allied intentions, but to convince the Germans of a completely false set of intentions so thoroughly that they would commit their forces accordingly. Bevan was not the first to understand the power of deception in warfare. The ancient Chinese general Sun Tzu had written that all warfare is based on deception. The British themselves had used elaborate ruses in North Africa, where dummy tanks and false radio traffic had confused Rommel about the strength and location of British forces. But what Bevan was proposing was something far more ambitious. A deception operation that would span months, involve thousands of personnel, and require the coordination of every aspect of Allied intelligence, communications, and operational security. The plan that emerged from the London controlling section in late 1943 was breathtaking in its scope. The Allies would create not just false information, but an entire false reality, a phantom army group complete with commanders, units, equipment, and a logical operational plan. This fictional force would be built up over months through every channel the Germans used for intelligence gathering: aerial reconnaissance, signals intelligence, agent reports, and even careless talk that might be overheard by German spies. The Phantom Force was designated the First United States Army Group, or FUSAG. On paper, it was a massive formation consisting of 11 divisions: American, Canadian, British, and Free French, totaling more than 150,000 men. To command this fictional army, the Allies chose the one general whose presence would lend absolute credibility: Lieutenant General George S. Patton. Patton, whose lightning advance across Sicily in 1943 had made him a household name and earned him grudging respect even from German commanders, was the obvious choice to lead the invasion of Europe. The Germans believed this, expected this, and planned for this. So, when Allied intelligence allowed the Germans to discover that Patton was in southeastern England, taking command of FUSAG, it seemed to confirm their assumptions. What the Germans didn't know was that Patton was being deliberately sidelined, kept away from the real invasion planning as punishment for slapping a shell-shocked soldier in Sicily, an incident that had nearly ended his career. The Allies, with characteristic cunning, had turned Patton's disgrace into a strategic asset. But creating a fictional army required more than just assigning a famous general to command it. The Germans would need to see evidence of FUSAG's existence through every intelligence channel they possessed. This is where the operation became truly extraordinary in its attention to detail. For aerial reconnaissance, the Allies turned to an unlikely source: the British film industry. Set designers from Shepperton Studios, special effects artists who had worked on major motion pictures, and theatrical prop makers were recruited into a top-secret unit that came to be known informally as the Magic Gang. Their mission was to create an army that would look real from the air but didn't actually exist on the ground. The head of this unit was Colonel Sir John Turner, a professional engineer who had worked in the film industry before the war. Turner understood that creating convincing fakes wasn't about perfect replication. It was about understanding what the enemy would be looking for and giving them exactly that. German reconnaissance pilots and photo analysts were trained to identify military equipment by its shape, shadow, and spacing. They looked for patterns: tanks arranged in standard formation, landing craft moored in logical positions, supply dumps laid out according to military doctrine. Turner's team gave them all of that. They inflated rubber tanks, dozens of them, manufactured in secret factories and transported to staging areas in southeastern England. From 10,000 feet, these inflatables were indistinguishable from real tanks. They had the correct dimensions, the correct shadow profiles, and even details like fake treads that would show in the mud. When German reconnaissance photographed them, analysts in Berlin saw Sherman tanks and had no reason to suspect otherwise. The landing craft were even more ingenious. Real landing craft were needed for the actual invasion at Normandy, so none could be spared for the deception. Instead, Turner's team built frameworks of wood and canvas that floated on old oil drums. From the air, they looked like landing craft, the right size, the right shape, moored in the harbors of Dover, Folkestone, and other ports facing Calais. The team even created damage on some of the fake craft, knowing that German intelligence would expect to see evidence of training accidents and minor mishaps. But visual deception was only one layer. The Germans had another primary source of intelligence: signals intercept. The Funkaufklärung, German signals intelligence monitored Allied radio traffic constantly, looking for patterns that would reveal unit locations, strengths, and intentions. To feed this intelligence channel, the Allies created an entirely fictional radio network for FUSAG. Real radio operators, stationed at various bases across southeastern England, transmitted thousands of messages daily. These weren't random gibberish, they were carefully scripted communications that told a coherent story. Supply officers requested spare parts for specific vehicles. Medical units reported casualty numbers from training exercises. Unit commanders coordinated movement schedules. All of it was fake, but all of it was consistent, detailed, and exactly what the Germans would expect to intercept from a real army preparing for invasion. The officer responsible for this radio deception was Major Derek Leviton, a former BBC radio engineer who understood not just what the messages should say, but how they should sound. German signals analysts didn't just read transcripts, they listened to the actual transmissions, and they had become skilled at identifying individual radio operators by their fist, the unique pattern of dots and dashes each operator produced. Leviton ensured that FUSAG's phantom radio operators each had distinctive fists, and that these same operators appeared consistently over weeks and months, building a pattern that German analysts would recognize and trust. The radio deception went beyond simple messaging. The Allies created the electronic signature of an entire army, radio nets operating at division, corps, and army group levels, each following proper communications protocols, each maintaining the security procedures that real units would use. German listening posts picked up these signals, tracked them, mapped them, and concluded that a massive force was indeed assembling in southeastern England. But the Allies weren't content with just visual and signals deception. They knew the Germans had spies in Britain, or believed they did, and these spies represented another channel through which false information could be fed. What the Germans didn't know was that British counterintelligence, operating under the code name the 20 Committee, written as XX, the Roman, numeral for 20, but also representing double cross, had identified every German agent in Britain and turned them into double agents. These double agents working under British control sent a steady stream of reports back to their German handlers. These reports were masterfully crafted by 20 Committee officers, particularly the legendary J.C. Masterman, an Oxford Don who approached counterintelligence with the analytical rigor of a chess master. The reports had to be accurate enough to maintain the agent's credibility. They included true information about units, equipment, and locations that the Germans could verify through other sources. But woven into these accurate reports was the crucial deception. Information about FUSAG, its strength, its location, and its apparent preparation to invade at Calais. One of the most important double agents was a Spanish national codenamed Garbo by the British and Alaric by the Germans. His real name was Juan Pujol Garcia, and he was perhaps the most successful double agent of World War II. Garbo had initially approached British intelligence offering his services, been rejected, and then approached the Germans instead. He convinced the Abwehr, German military intelligence, that he was an ardent Nazi sympathizer living in London with access to military information. In reality, he was in Lisbon, creating elaborate fictional reports based on guidebooks and magazine articles. His reports were so convincing that the Germans paid him handsomely and considered him one of their most valuable agents. When the British finally realized what Garbo was doing, they brought him to England and put him to work for the 20 Committee. Over the next 2 years, Garbo built an entire fictional network of sub-agents, all of whom existed only in his reports, who supposedly provided him with intelligence from across Britain. By 1944, the Germans trusted Garbo completely. When he reported that Patton was in command of FUSAG in southeastern England, the Germans believed him without question. Another crucial double agent was codenamed Brutus, a Polish Air Force officer named Roman Cherniavsky, who had been captured by the Germans, turned, and sent to Britain as a spy. British intelligence turned him again, and Brutus began sending reports that corroborated what Garbo was saying. The genius of the 20 Committee's operation was that the double agents never simply agreed. That would have been suspicious. Instead, their reports were slightly different, seen from different perspectives, occasionally contradicting each other on minor details while agreeing on the crucial facts. This created the illusion of independent sources, all pointing to the same conclusion.
But creating a fictional army
Was only half the challenge. The Allies also had to ensure that evidence of the real invasion preparations at Portsmouth, Southampton, and other ports along England's southern coast, where the actual assault on Normandy was being prepared, didn't alert the Germans to the true plan. This required a parallel deception operation known as Fortitude South, which worked to minimize the apparent significance of the real buildup while maximizing the apparent significance of the fake buildup. Real units preparing for D-Day maintained strict radio silence. When they had to communicate, they used secure landlines rather than radio. Their equipment was camouflaged far more carefully than FUSAG's fake equipment. When German reconnaissance planes penetrated British air defenses, and the Allies deliberately allowed some to do so, they were subtly guided by British fighters toward the FUSAG concentration areas and away from the real staging areas. The few photographs of real invasion preparations that did reach German intelligence were mixed with dozens of photographs of fake preparations, creating the impression that the southeastern buildup was far larger and more advanced. The Allies even staged elaborate security theatre. Patton made public appearances in southeastern England, reviewing troops that were actually part of other units temporarily reassigned for photo opportunities. He gave speeches that were carefully leaked to German intelligence through the double agents. British newspapers, operating under strict censorship, were nevertheless allowed to publish vague references to an American Army commander being seen in Kent, knowing these references would be picked up by German intelligence analysts scouring British media for clues. As D-Day approached, the deception operation reached its crescendo. In late May 1944, FUSAG's fake radio traffic increased to a fever pitch, suggesting final preparations for an imminent invasion. The double agents reported that Patton had been seen conferring with Eisenhower, that supplies were being moved to forward positions, that briefings were being held for senior officers. All of it pointed to an invasion at Calais, and all of it was coordinated to peak in early June. On the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, the real invasion began at Normandy. Over 150,000 Allied troops crossed the English Channel, landed on 5 beaches, and began the liberation of France. German commanders, monitoring the assault, faced a critical decision. Was this the main invasion, or was it a feint designed to draw German reserves away from the real invasion at Calais? This was the moment when Operation Fortitude would either succeed or fail. Everything depended on convincing the Germans, even as Allied troops were fighting and dying on the beaches of Normandy, that Normandy was secondary and Calais was still the primary objective. The 20 Committee activated its final play. Garbo, the double agent the Germans trusted most completely, sent an urgent message to his German handlers on June 9th, 3 days after D-Day. Working with his British controllers, he had spent those 3 days silent, creating the impression that he was working desperately to gather intelligence about what was happening. His message, when it came, was emphatic. The Normandy invasion was a diversion. His network of sub-agents had confirmed that FUSAG remained in southeastern England, fully equipped and apparently ready to launch the main invasion at Calais. The message was a masterpiece of deception craft. It arrived late enough that the Germans couldn't use it to reinforce Normandy before the beachhead was established, but early enough that they could still redeploy forces if they believed Calais was still threatened. Garbeau's German handler, delighted to receive such crucial intelligence, passed it immediately to the High Command with his strongest endorsement. Adolf Hitler, at his headquarters in Berchtesgaden, read the report and made his decision. He ordered that the 15th Army, comprising 19 divisions and stationed in the Pas-de-Calais region, should remain in position to repel the expected invasion there. These divisions, over 200,000 men, with tanks, artillery and air support, would stay at Calais while the battle raged at Normandy. It was exactly what the Allies had hoped for. The German forces at Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come, were unable to reinforce their comrades who were fighting desperately to push the Allies back into the sea at Normandy. For weeks after D-Day, as the Allies expanded their beachhead and began breaking out into the French countryside, Hitler kept the 15th Army at Calais, convinced that Patton's FUSAG would still launch the main invasion. By the time the Germans realized they had been deceived, it was too late. The Normandy beachhead was secure, Allied forces were pushing inland, and the liberation of France had begun. The 15th Army was finally released to move to Normandy in late July, but by then, the opportunity to crush the invasion at the beaches had long passed. The success of Operation Fortitude was so complete that even after the war, when German officers were interrogated about the invasion, many still believed that FUSAG had been real. They couldn't understand why Patton's army group had never invaded at Calais. Some speculated that the plan had been cancelled due to the success at Normandy. Others believed that bad weather or supply problems had prevented the Calais invasion. Very few realized that they had been victims of an elaborate deception, that the army they had prepared to fight had never existed at all. The statistics of the deception are remarkable. The entire physical infrastructure of FUSAG, the rubber tanks, the fake landing craft, the dummy equipment, had cost less than £50,000 to produce, roughly equivalent to the cost of a single real tank. The radio operators maintaining the fictional communications network numbered fewer than 50. The double agents, who had been so crucial to selling the deception, were counted on two hands.
Against this tiny investment,
The Germans had committed 19 divisions, over 200,000 men, to defending against an attack that never came. Military historians have estimated that if those divisions had been available to reinforce Normandy in the first week after D-Day, they might have pushed the Allies back into the sea. At minimum, they would have made the battle far more costly in Allied lives and possibly delayed the liberation of France by months. Colonel Turner, the theatrical engineer who had created FUSAG's physical camouflage, visited Normandy in August 1944 after the breakout from the beachhead. He stood on a bluff overlooking Omaha Beach, where American forces had suffered their heaviest casualties on D-Day, and reflected on what had been accomplished. In his unpublished memoirs, later deposited in the Imperial War Museum, he wrote, "We gave them rubber and canvas, and told them it was steel and men. They believed us because we understood what they expected to see. That is the essence of all magic, not making the impossible happen, but making the audience believe they've seen what they expected to see." Major Leviton, the radio engineer who had orchestrated FUSAG's phantom communications, had his own revelation. After the war, when German signals intelligence records were captured and analyzed, he discovered that German analysts had not only detected and tracked FUSAG's radio network, but had created detailed organizational charts showing its structure, strength, and communications protocols. They had done exactly what Leviton had hoped they would do. They had analyzed real patterns, drawn logical conclusions, and never questioned whether the underlying reality was itself false. "We didn't fool them," Leviton later said in an interview with British military intelligence historians. We gave them accurate data from which they drew incorrect conclusions. That's far more effective than trying to hide or lie directly. The double agents, who had been so crucial to the operation, received recognition in various forms. Garbo was awarded both the Iron Cross by Germany, before they knew he was a double agent, and the Member of the Order of the British Empire by Britain, after the war. He remains one of only a handful of people to have been decorated by both sides in World War II. Brutus returned to Poland after the war, though his service to Britain remained classified for decades. Several other double agents continued working for British intelligence through the Cold War, their skills at deception proving valuable in a new conflict. As for Patton, he was finally released from his role as commander of the Phantom Fusag and given command of the very real Third Army in late July 1944. He led it on a spectacular advance across France, finally getting the combat command he had craved. But even after Patton left to take up real command, the Germans continued to believe in Fusag's existence. The fictional army was kept alive through continued radio deception and double agent reports until September 1944, well after the Normandy campaign had ended. The true genius of Operation Fortitude lay not in any single element, but in the integration of multiple deception channels into a coherent whole. Visual deception, signals deception, and human intelligence all told the same story, each reinforcing the others. When German intelligence analysts in Berlin sat down to evaluate the Allied invasion threat, they didn't see contradictions or gaps in the intelligence. They saw confirmation from multiple independent sources, all pointing to the same conclusion. This integration was the work of the London Controlling Section and the 20 Committee, organizations whose existence was itself classified until decades after the war. These were not military units in the traditional sense. They were staffed by academics, journalists, lawyers, artists, and businessmen. People who understood psychology, narrative, and persuasion, rather than tactics and logistics. They approached warfare not as a matter of firepower and maneuver, but as a matter of perception and belief. John Bevan, who had conceived the overall deception strategy, was later asked by a military historian whether he had ever doubted the plan would work. His response was characteristically thoughtful. Every day. The problem with deception is that you're trying to make the enemy believe something that isn't true, but you can only judge your success by their actions, which you observe through your own intelligence. So you're watching them watching you, trying to determine if they believe what you're showing them. But you can never be entirely certain until the moment of crisis. In our case, that moment was when Hitler decided to keep the 15th Army at Calais. When we learned of that decision, we knew we had succeeded. The lessons of Operation Fortitude influenced military deception operations for decades after World War II. During the Cold War, both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces incorporated elaborate deception protocols into their war planning, recognizing that an adversary's perceptions could be as important as actual military capabilities. The United States used deceptive communications to mislead North Vietnamese forces about American intentions. The Israelis used mock-ups and dummy equipment to deceive Egyptian and Syrian intelligence before the Yom Kippur War. But perhaps the most important legacy of Fortitude is the recognition that in warfare, as in all human conflict, reality is not fixed but perceived. The German High Command didn't lose because their intelligence was bad. In many cases, their intelligence was quite good. They lost because they were looking at a carefully constructed false reality and interpreting accurate data about that false reality to reach incorrect conclusions about the true reality. Werner Baumbach, the reconnaissance pilot who had photographed Fusag's fake tanks in May 1944, survived the war and later learned that what he had photographed were rubber dummies. In his post-war memoir, published in German in 1952. He wrote with grudging admiration, "We were not stupid. We were not blind. We were trained observers with good equipment. We saw what was there to be seen and reported it accurately. The trick was that what was there to be seen had been placed there deliberately for us to see. We were not defeated by Allied superiority in the air, though they had that. We were defeated by Allied superiority in imagination. The physical remnants of Operation Fortitude, the rubber tanks, the wooden landing craft, the inflatable vehicles, were mostly destroyed or scrapped after the war. A few pieces survive in military museums, curiosities from a bygone era when deception meant theatrical props rather than digital manipulation. But these artifacts, fragile and crude as they appear now, represent something profound: the victory of imagination over materiel, of psychology over firepower, of clever deception over brute force. On the cliffs above Dover, where some of the most elaborate fake installations had been created, there is now a small memorial to Operation Fortitude, installed in 2004 on the 60th anniversary of D-Day. The inscription reads simply, "Here stood an army that never was, and by standing here, saved the lives of thousands who were." It's a fitting tribute to an operation that demonstrates an enduring truth about warfare. Sometimes the army you don't have is more powerful than the army you do, if your enemy believes in it strongly enough. In the final analysis, Operation Fortitude succeeded because it understood a fundamental principle. People believe what makes sense to them. The Germans expected the invasion to come at Calais because it was the logical location, the shortest channel crossing, the most direct route to Germany. They expected Patton to command it because he was the Allies' best field commander. They expected to see evidence of the build-up through reconnaissance, signals intercept, and agent reports because those were their primary intelligence channels. The Allies simply gave them what they expected, crafted with such care and attention to detail that questioning it seemed unnecessary. The fake army looked real because it was designed by people who understood exactly how the Germans would observe it. The radio traffic sounded real because it was created by people who understood exactly how the Germans would analyze it. The agent reports seemed credible because they were delivered by sources the Germans already trusted. And so Adolf Hitler, arguably the most paranoid leader of the 20th century, surrounded by a massive intelligence apparatus, supported by some of the most professional military officers in the world, made the decision to keep 19 divisions at Calais, waiting for an invasion that existed only in the imagination of a few dozen British intelligence officers, radio operators, and theatrical designers. It was, without question, one of the greatest tricks ever played in warfare, and the Germans never knew they'd been fooled until it was far too late to matter. The magic trick had worked. The audience had seen exactly what the magicians wanted them to see, and by the time they realized they'd been deceived, the show was over and the war was won.